Picture this. It is the summer of 479 BC, and you are a Spartan warrior standing in the scorching heat of central Greece. Your king is dead. Your friends are dead. 300 of your brothers died buying you time at a mountain pass called Thermopylae. The Persians killed them all, then marched south and burned Athens to the ground. Now, standing in front of you on the plains of Plataea is the largest army ever assembled in the ancient world. 120,000 Persian soldiers stretch across the horizon like a human ocean. Their armor glitters in the morning sun. Their cavalry outnumbers your entire allied force. They've conquered half the known world, and they're certain you're next. But here's what they don't understand about Spartans. You don't retreat, you don't negotiate, and you especially don't forget. For an entire year, you've watched the Persians parade through Greece like they own it. You've heard them laugh about Thermopylae, calling it a minor inconvenience. They think the death of King Leonidas in the 300 was just the cost of doing business. They're wrong. Today, the debt comes due. Today, Sparta stops running and starts killing. And by the time the sun sets over Plataea, the Persian Empire will learn a lesson it will never forget. You don't humiliate Sparta and walk away. Before diving into the bloodiest revenge in ancient history, if you enjoy learning about the moments that shaped Western civilization, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared fascination with the past. To understand why Plataea became a slaughterhouse, you have to go back 1 year to a narrow mountain pass where everything changed. In 480 BC, King Xerxes of Persia invaded Greece with the largest military force the ancient world had ever seen. Ancient sources claim he brought over 2 million men. Modern historians estimate somewhere between 150,000 and 300,000 combat troops, supported by the largest naval fleet ever assembled. Either way, it was overwhelming. It was designed to be overwhelming. Xerxes wasn't just conquering Greece. He was making a statement. The invasion was personal for Xerxes. 10 years earlier, his father Darius had sent an expedition to punish Athens for supporting Greek cities in Asia Minor that had rebelled against Persian rule. That expedition ended in disaster at Marathon, where 10,000 Athenians defeated 25,000 Persians on the beaches. The defeat humiliated the Persian Empire. Darius died before he could take revenge, and that burden fell to his son. Xerxes spent 4 years preparing. He didn't want to defeat Greece, he wanted to erase it. The preparation was unprecedented. Xerxes ordered his engineers to build 2 pontoon bridges across the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Asia from Europe. When a storm destroyed the bridges, Xerxes ordered the sea itself whipped 300 times as punishment. His engineers built new bridges using hundreds of ships lashed together. The army crossed on these floating roads, taking 7 days and nights to complete the passage. It was a statement of power. Nature itself would bow to the Persian king. The Greeks were terrified. Most city-states immediately surrendered, giving earth and water to the Persian king as symbols of submission. But not Sparta. When Persian ambassadors came to Sparta demanding submission, the Spartans threw them down a well and told them to dig their own earth and water out of the bottom. It was perhaps the most Spartan response in history. Athens threw their Persian ambassadors down a similar pit. Both cities knew what was coming. They knew they'd signed their own death warrants. They didn't care. King Leonidas, the Spartan monarch, knew the mathematics were impossible. The Persians could not be beaten in open battle, so he chose a different battlefield. He chose Thermopylae. The Hot Gates, a narrow coastal pass where the massive Persian numbers meant nothing. The pass was so narrow that only a few men could fight side by side at any given moment. It was the perfect force multiplier. The cliffs rose on one side, the sea lapped on the other, and in between was just enough space for Sparta to prove a point. Leonidas marched to Thermopylae with just 300 Spartan warriors. These weren't random soldiers. Each man was a full citizen of Sparta, a member of the elite warrior class. Each had living sons to carry on their family line. They knew they were marching to their deaths. They went anyway. The night before they left, they held a final dinner with their families. The wives knew. The mothers knew. They said goodbye without tears because crying was considered weakness. One Spartan mother handed her son his shield and told him, "Come back with this or on it, either victorious or dead." There was no middle ground. For 3 days, those 300 men, supported by about 7,000 other Greek allies, held the pass against the entire Persian army. Wave after wave of Persian infantry crashed against the Spartan shields and died. Xerxes sent his elite troops, the Immortals, 10,000 warriors who were supposed to be unstoppable. The Spartans killed them by the hundreds. The Persian dead piled up so high in the pass that the bodies became obstacles. Soldiers stumbled over corpses 3 deep. The fighting was not the romantic clash of heroes from legend. It was industrial butchery. The Spartans fought in shifts. When the front rank grew exhausted from killing, they'd rotate to the rear, and fresh men would step forward. The heat was suffocating. The stench of blood and open bowels filled the narrow pass. Flies swarmed in black clouds. Men slipped on intestines, and blood-slicked stones. The Persians kept coming because Xerxes gave them no choice. Officers with whips drove the soldiers forward. Retreat meant death by whipping. Attack meant probable death by Spartan spear. They chose the spear. But on the 3rd day, betrayal changed everything. A local Greek trader named Ephialtes showed the Persians a hidden mountain path that led behind the Greek position. The path was called Antiquity, a goat track that wound through the heights above Thermopylae. Leonidas had posted troops to guard it, but they were overwhelmed by the Persian force that came through in the night. By dawn, the Spartans were surrounded. Leonidas realized the trap was closing. He dismissed most of his allies, keeping only the 300 Spartans and about 700 Thespians who refused to abandon them. Some historians suggest Leonidas also kept 400 Thebans as hostages, suspecting their loyalty. They made their final stand on a small hill called the Kolonos. The Persians surrounded them and unleashed a storm of arrows. Ancient sources say the arrows were so thick they blocked out the sun. When a Spartan soldier complained about this, another Spartan named Dionysus laughed and said, "Good, then we'll fight in the shade." They fought until every single Greek warrior was dead. The Spartans' spears broke. They drew their swords. Their swords broke. They fought with their bare hands, biting and clawing at Persian soldiers. When it was over, Xerxes ordered his men to find Leonidas's body. When they did, the Persian king was so enraged by the resistance that he ordered the body decapitated and crucified. For a culture that respected fallen warriors, this was the ultimate insult. That desecration became a blood debt that Sparta would repay with interest. The Persians marched south toward Athens. The Athenian leadership, understanding they couldn't defend their city, evacuated the entire population to the island of Salamis and the city of Troezen. It was one of the largest civilian evacuations in ancient history. Over 200,000 people, mostly women, children, and the elderly, were ferried across the Saronic Gulf in whatever boats could be found. Men of fighting age stayed behind to crew the Athenian navy. When the Persians arrived at Athens, they found it empty. They burned it anyway. The Acropolis, the temples, the houses, everything. The smoke could be seen for miles. The Greeks watching from Salamis could only stand and watch their city die. But the Greeks weren't defeated. The Athenian general Themistocles lured the Persian fleet into the narrow straits of Salamis and destroyed it. The Greek triremes, lighter and more maneuverable in tight spaces, tore through the massive Persian fleet like wolves among sheep. The trireme was a beautiful killing machine. It had 3 banks of oars, a bronze ram at the prow, and a crew of 200 men. In the narrow waters of Salamis, these ships could accelerate to ramming speed in seconds, punch a hole below the waterline of a Persian vessel, then backwater and move to the next target. The Persian ships were larger and heavier, built for deep water sailing. In the confined strait, they became targets. Xerxes watched from a throne on the shore as his navy was annihilated. He lost over 200 ships in a single afternoon. Bodies and debris choked the strait. The water turned red. Persian sailors who abandoned ship were hunted down by Greek marines in small boats. It wasn't a battle. It was a slaughter that made Thermopylae look merciful. The psychological impact on Xerxes was devastating. He'd been so confident that he'd brought his throne to watch the victory. Instead, he watched the ocean swallow his fleet. With winter approaching and his supply lines threatened, Xerxes made a crucial decision. He took most of his army and returned to Persia, leaving behind his best general, Mardonius, with a force of about 120,000 elite troops to finish the job. Mardonius was given a clear mission: conquer Greece or die trying. Xerxes was done playing games. He wanted results. Mardonius was not a fool. He was one of Persia's finest commanders, a man who'd fought in campaigns from Egypt to India. He'd served under Darius and now Xerxes. He understood Greek warfare better than perhaps any Persian alive. He knew the Greeks were dangerous in close combat, but vulnerable to cavalry and archery. He knew their coalitions were fragile, held together by temporary fear rather than lasting loyalty. His strategy was patient and psychological. He would spend the winter rebuilding, then used diplomacy and intimidation to fracture the Greek alliance before the spring fighting season. For the Greeks, this was both a victory and a new problem. They'd survived the initial invasion, but they still had a massive Persian army occupying their land. Mardonius spent the winter of 480 to 479 BC in Thessaly, in northern Greece, rebuilding his forces and planning his campaign. He sent diplomats to Athens offering peace. If Athens would ally with Persia, he promised wealth, autonomy, and power. He even offered to rebuild the city the Persians had burned, better than before. The Athenians refused. They'd already lost their city once. They weren't going to sell it now. But the offer terrified Sparta. The Spartan leadership realized that if Athens switched sides, the entire strategic balance would collapse. Athens had the largest navy in Greece. If that navy became Persian, the Spartans would face amphibious assault from the sea while Mardonius attacked from the north. The defensive wall across the Isthmus of Corinth, which the Spartans had been building, would become worthless. This refusal forced the Spartans into action. Sparta had a complicated relationship with the rest of Greece. They were powerful, disciplined, and respected, but they were also paranoid and isolationist. Sparta had spent years building a wall across the Isthmus of Corinth, a narrow strip of land connecting the Peloponnese to the rest of Greece. Their strategy was simple: let the Persians have northern Greece. As long as Sparta was safe behind the wall, they didn't care. But now that calculus changed. They couldn't hide anymore. They had to fight. The man Sparta chose to lead this fight was Pausanias, the nephew of the dead king Leonidas. He was young, perhaps only in his mid-20s, and this was his first major command. The pressure on him was immense. He was commanding an army in the shadow of his uncle's legend. Every Spartan warrior in his force had friends or relatives who died at Thermopylae. This wasn't just a military campaign. It was personal. It was about honor, revenge, and proving that the sacrifice at Thermopylae hadn't been in vain. Pausanias was regent for Leonidas' young son, who was too young to rule. He was educated in the Spartan agoge, the brutal military training system, and had proven himself in smaller conflicts. But commanding the largest Spartan force ever deployed was different. He had to balance military strategy with politics. He had to keep the Greek coalition together while preparing for battle against an enemy that outnumbered him. One mistake and he'd be remembered as the man who wasted the opportunity Leonidas had purchased with blood. Pausanias assembled the largest Spartan force ever deployed outside the Peloponnese. 5,000 full Spartan citizens marched north, each accompanied by 7 helots, the enslaved workers who served as light infantry and support troops. That gave Sparta 35,000 men just from their contingent. They were joined by allies from across Greece. Athens sent 8,000 hoplites under the command of Aristides the Just. Corinth sent 5,000. Megara sent 3,000. Smaller city-states contributed hundreds or dozens each. Even cities that had been neutral sent token forces, unwilling to be seen as cowards or Persian sympathizers. In total, the Greek coalition numbered somewhere between 70,000 and 110,000 men. It was the largest Greek army ever assembled to that point, but it was still smaller than the Persian force, and it was made up of dozens of different city-states with different agendas, different commanders, and different levels of training. Sparta had discipline and experience. Athens had numbers and naval power. The smaller cities had courage, but little else. Pausanias had to somehow forge this fractious coalition into a fighting force capable of facing Mardonius. It was like herding cats, except the cats hated each other and spoke different dialects. The two armies began maneuvering in the summer of 479 BC. Mardonius held the high ground near the city of Thebes, in central Greece. Thebes had sided with the Persians, giving Mardonius a secure base. The Greeks marched north and took up position on the foothills of Mount Cithaeron near the small town of Plataea. The stage was set for the largest land battle of the Persian Wars. But what happened next wasn't a glorious charge. It was a week of psychological warfare, logistical nightmares, and mistakes that nearly destroyed the Greek coalition before the fighting even began. When the Greek army arrived at Plataea, they thought they had chosen the perfect defensive position. They deployed along the northern slopes of Mount Cithaeron, with high ground behind them and a clear view of the plains below. The position gave them a tactical advantage. The Persians would have to attack uphill, negating their cavalry superiority. Pausanias could see the entire Persian camp from his position. He could count their fires at night. He knew exactly where the enemy was. But Mardonius had been studying Greek tactics for a decade. He knew exactly what Pausanias was thinking. The Persian camp was a city unto itself. Ancient sources describe it as covering miles of the Boeotian plain. It was fortified with wooden palisades, creating walls 10 feet high from timber harvested from nearby forests. Thousands of tents housed the troops. There were separate quarters for each ethnic contingent. The Persians and Medes had elaborate pavilions with carpets and furniture. The subject troops had simpler accommodations. At the center was Mardonius's headquarters, a complex that rivaled a royal palace. He brought his wealth with him, confident of victory. The Persian army was a multinational coalition representing every corner of the empire. There were Medes in scale armor, looking like walking dragons with their overlapping bronze plates. Bactrians carried powerful composite bows that could punch through Greek shields at 300 yards. Indian infantry wore cotton armor, thick layers of quilted fabric that could stop arrows and deflect sword cuts. Egyptian marines who'd survived the disaster at Salamis fought with sickle swords and figure-8 shields. There were Thracians, Phrygians, Lydians, and dozens of other peoples, all united under Persian command. At the core were the Persian and Median elite troops, about 50,000 men who represented the best-trained and best-equipped soldiers in the world. These men had conquered Babylon, Egypt, and half of India. They'd put down rebellions from the Mediterranean to the borders of China. They were professionals who'd spent their entire adult lives at war. They looked at the Greek militia with contempt, farmers playing soldier. Mardonius deployed his forces carefully. On his right wing, he placed the Persian and Median heavy infantry, about 50,000 men, directly opposite the Spartans. This was a calculated insult. The Persians knew the Spartans wanted revenge for Thermopylae. Mardonius was giving them a target. He was telling them that the same troops who'd fought their king would be the ones to break them. In the center, he placed his subject Greek allies, cities that had surrendered to Xerxes. These troops were less reliable, but still dangerous. They knew Greek tactics intimately and fought with Greek weapons. On his left wing, he positioned the rest of his infantry, backed by thousands of cavalry. The cavalry was Mardonius's ace in the hole. The Persians had perhaps 10,000 horsemen, and the Greeks had almost none. On the open plains of Boeotia, those cavalry could dominate. They could scout, raid supply lines, and harass infantry formations. Every military advantage the Greeks had on the slopes of Kithaeron evaporated the moment they stepped onto flat ground. A hoplite phalanx could crush infantry, but it was helpless against fast-moving horsemen who could shoot arrows and retreat before the Greeks could respond. For the first few days, both armies sat and watched each other. Neither commander wanted to attack. Pausanias knew that if he marched down onto the plain, the Persian cavalry would tear his flanks apart. Mardonius knew that if he attacked uphill, his numerical advantage meant nothing. His cavalry couldn't charge uphill effectively. His archers would be shooting upward, reducing their range and accuracy. It was a stalemate. But Mardonius was patient. He didn't need to win a battle. He just needed to break the Greek coalition. He just needed to make them hungry, thirsty, and desperate enough to make a mistake. On the fourth day, the Persian cavalry made their move. They swept across the plain in massive formations, circling the Greek position, testing for weaknesses. The horses were magnificent animals, bred for war, trained to charge into combat without flinching. The riders were skilled beyond anything the Greeks had seen. They could shoot arrows accurately at full gallop, hitting targets 200 yards away. They could wheel and reform in seconds, moving with a coordination that looked choreographed. The Greeks had no effective counter. Their hoplites, heavily armored infantry designed to fight in tight formations, were helpless against fast-moving horsemen. A hoplite's shield weighed 15 pounds and was designed to protect against frontal attacks. It was useless against arrows coming from the side or rear. The cavalry harassed Greek supply convoys, killed foragers, and made it impossible for the Greeks to gather food or water safely. Men who left the camp to gather firewood or hunt game were found days later with Persian arrows in their backs. Then Mardonius struck at the Greeks' most critical vulnerability: water. The Greek position relied on a spring called Gargaphia for fresh water. It was the only reliable water source near their camp. Without it, the army would have to send parties miles away to find water, exposing them to cavalry attack. The Persian cavalry launched a raid directly at the spring. They drove off the Greek guards in a brief but brutal skirmish. Then they did something brilliant and cruel. They filled the spring with dirt, dead animals, and debris, making the water undrinkable. They stuffed sheep carcasses into the source. They dumped wagon loads of soil. They urinated into it. By the time they were done, Gargaphia was a sewage pit. It was a tactical masterstroke. Without water, the Greek army couldn't stay where it was. In the summer heat of central Greece, men needed water constantly. Without it, they'd die in days. Pausanias faced an impossible decision. He could stay on the high ground and watch his army die of thirst, or he could retreat to a new position with water and risk being caught in the open by Persian cavalry. Every option was bad. Every choice carried risks that could destroy the coalition. He chose to retreat, but the execution became a disaster. The plan was to fall back during the night to a position called the Island, a strip of land between two rivers closer to Plataea. The Greek army would move in stages. The center would move first, taking up the new position. Then the wings would follow, with the Spartans and Athenians covering the retreat. It should have been a coordinated, disciplined withdrawal. Military textbooks should have been written about it. It became chaos. The Greek allies in the center, terrified of being caught by Persian cavalry in the dark, didn't stop at the island. They kept marching all the way to the walls of Plataea, about 10 miles from their original position. They were supposed to be the anchor of the new defensive line. Instead, they were cowering behind city walls, leaving the Spartans and Athenians exposed. Pausanias was furious, but there was nothing he could do. The center was gone, leaving a massive gap in the Greek line. Meanwhile, one of the Spartan battalion commanders, a man named Amompharatus, refused to move at all. He considered retreat dishonorable. He didn't care about water or tactics or Persian cavalry. He saw the order to retreat as cowardice, and he would not participate in cowardice. He sat on the hillside with his battalion of 600 men, daring Pausanias to leave him behind. This was insubordination, on a scale that should have been punishable by death, but Pausanias couldn't execute him. Amompharatus was a hero of previous battles. His men were loyal to him. Killing him would fracture the Spartan contingent at the worst possible moment. Pausanias tried to reason with him. He argued, he threatened, nothing worked. Amompharatus picked up a rock and threw it at Pausanias' feet, saying, "Here is my vote against running away from strangers." The insult was clear. Retreating was the act of cowards. As dawn approached, Pausanias had achieved nothing. Part of his army was at Plataea, part was scattered across the hills, and his elite Spartan troops were divided and exposed. It was exactly the kind of disorder Mardonius had been waiting for. As the sun rose on the morning of the battle, the Persian scouts reported the chaos in the Greek lines. Mardonius couldn't believe his luck. The disciplined Greek phalanx had dissolved into scattered groups stumbling across open ground. This was the moment he'd been engineering for a week. The Greeks were vulnerable, divided, and caught in the open. He ordered his entire army to advance. The drums began to beat, a deep, rhythmic pounding that could be heard for miles. The horns sounded, high and piercing. 120,000 men surged forward like a human tsunami, kicking up dust clouds that rose into the morning sky. The Greeks were caught in the worst possible position. The Spartans were still trying to organize their retreat. Amompharatus had finally agreed to move, but slowly, making his displeasure known with every step. The Athenians were isolated on a different hill, separated from the Spartans by over a mile of open ground. The allies were miles away behind walls, effectively out of the battle before it began. Mardonius focused his attack on the Spartans. He knew that if he broke Sparta, the war was over. The rest of Greece would sue for peace within days. The Persian cavalry swept around the Spartan flanks, cutting them off from any retreat. Thousands of horsemen formed a living wall, blocking escape routes, shooting arrows into the Spartan rear ranks. Then the Persian heavy infantry advanced. They moved in blocks of 10,000 men, formed by ethnic contingent. The Persians and Medes came first, the elite troops in their finest armor. Behind them came the subject peoples, eager to prove their loyalty to the empire. The Persians deployed in their traditional manner. The front ranks carried large wicker shields called spara, rectangular shields as tall as a man and 3 feet wide. They planted these shields in the ground, creating a protective wall. Behind them, archers unleashed volley after volley of arrows. The Persian composite bow was a weapon of terrifying efficiency. Made from wood, horn, and sinew laminated together, it could shoot an arrow 300 yards with enough force to pierce bronze armor. The archers were trained from childhood. They could loose 12 arrows per minute, maintaining that rate for hours. The sky darkened with shafts. Thousands of arrows fell like rain on the Spartan position. The sound was like hail on a tile roof, a constant clatter of bronze arrowheads striking bronze shields and helmets. Men fell, pierced through gaps in their armor, arrows finding the weak points at the neck, armpit, and groin where protection was lighter. The Spartans raised their shields and endured. They didn't break formation. They didn't panic. They stood and took it, because that's what Spartans did. Pausanias needed divine approval before attacking. This wasn't superstition. In Greek military culture, generals consulted omens before battle. You didn't attack without favorable signs from the gods. Pausanias had his priests sacrificing sheep and reading their entrails, looking for signs. The first sacrifice was unfavorable. The second was unfavorable. The third, men were dying around him, but he waited. To attack without divine blessing would doom the army as surely as Persian arrows. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the omens turned favorable. Pausanias gave the order. The Spartans began to advance. This is where the legend of Spartan warfare becomes reality. The hoplite phalanx was the most effective infantry formation in the ancient world, and the Spartans had perfected it over centuries. Each man carried a large round shield called a hoplon, about 3 feet in diameter and made of wood covered in bronze. The shield weighed about 15 pounds and was held by a grip at the center and an armband at the rim. These shields overlapped, creating a wall of bronze that was nearly impenetrable from the front. In their right hands, they carried spears about 8 feet long with iron tips. The spear was the primary weapon, designed for thrusting over and around the shield wall. When the phalanx advanced, it moved as one organism, shields locked, spears leveled. The formation was typically 8 ranks deep. The front rank did the killing. The ranks behind pushed forward with their shields, adding their body weight to the assault, making the entire phalanx an unstoppable battering ram of flesh and bronze. The key to the phalanx was discipline. If even one man broke ranks or stepped out of formation, the entire line could collapse. Enemies could pour through the gap like water through a cracked dam. This is why Sparta trained its warriors from childhood. Every Spartan boy entered military training at age 7. For 13 years, they learned one thing: how to stand in line and kill. They didn't study music or philosophy or mathematics beyond the basics. They studied war. They learned to march in perfect step, to maintain formation under arrow fire, to kill with mechanical efficiency. By the time a Spartan reached age 20 and became a full citizen, he could march in perfect step for miles without breaking formation. He could fight for hours in the heat wearing 60 pounds of bronze armor. He could kill a man with a spear thrust and move to the next target without hesitation or remorse. They were machines, programmed for one purpose. At Plataea, that programming paid off. The Persian infantry was brave, but they weren't trained for this kind of fighting. Their wicker shields, while large, couldn't withstand the impact of a Greek spear thrust. The spara were designed to stop arrows, not the focused power of an 8-foot spear driven by a man trained since childhood to kill. Their armor was lighter, designed for mobility rather than protection. Lamellar armor made of small iron or bronze plates laced together was effective against slashing attacks, but vulnerable to thrusting spears. And they fought as individuals, not as a cohesive unit. Persian military doctrine emphasized personal courage and initiative. Greek doctrine emphasized becoming a cog in a killing machine. When the Spartan phalanx slammed into the Persian line, it was like a bronze battering ram hitting a wicker fence. The impact was devastating. Spartan spears punched through Persian shields and armor. The iron spearheads, driven with the full body weight of a trained warrior, pierced through wicker, through lamellar armor, through ribs and into hearts and lungs. Men in the front rank of the phalanx would stab overhand, aiming for the neck and face where armor was weakest. The throat was a favorite target. A spear through the throat killed instantly and prevented screaming that could frighten your own troops. If a spear broke, and spears broke constantly in the chaos of combat, they'd draw their short swords and continue killing at close range. The Spartan sword, called a xiphos, was about 2 feet long with a leaf-shaped blade. It was designed for stabbing in close quarters where there was no room to swing. The second rank of the phalanx would thrust their spears over the shoulders of the front rank, creating a forest of iron points that made approaching the formation suicidal. The ranks behind pushed forward with their shields, adding their body weight to the assault, turning the entire phalanx into a human steamroller that crushed everything in its path. The Persians died by the hundreds. Their officers screamed orders that couldn't be heard over the clash of bronze on bronze and the screams of wounded men. The sound of battle was deafening. Shields slamming together, spears scraping on armor, men shouting in a dozen different languages, the wounded crying for help or mercy or their mothers. It was chaos given form. The Persians tried to pull back, to reform their lines, to create space for their archers to shoot, but the Spartans gave them no space. The phalanx advanced step by step, walking over the bodies of the fallen, compressing the Persian formation into a tighter and tighter mass, where movement became impossible. But the Persians had numbers, and Mardonius was no coward. He rode into the thick of the fighting on a white horse, surrounded by his personal guard of 1,000 elite Persian cavalry. These were the best warriors in the empire. men chosen for their skill and loyalty. They were mounted on the finest horses, armed with the best weapons, and trained to protect their commander with their lives. Mardonius rallied his troops, and the Persian line stiffened. His presence alone was worth thousands of men. When soldiers saw their general fighting beside them, sharing their danger, they fought harder. For a time, the battle hung in balance. The Spartans were pushing forward, but slowly, grinding through a wall of human flesh that seemed endless. For every Persian who fell, another stepped forward. The Persian infantry, fighting for their empire and their lives, refused to break. They shoved back against the Spartan shields. They thrust with their shorter spears. They died and were replaced by the men behind them. It was a contest of attrition, and the Persians had more men to lose. Then the Athenians arrived. 8,000 Athenian hoplites had been marching toward the sound of battle since dawn. They'd been isolated on a different hill when the Persians attacked, separated from the Spartans by distance and Persian cavalry screens. The commander, Aristides, had two choices: march to help Sparta and risk being caught by cavalry in the open, or stay safe on his hill and watch Sparta die. If Sparta fell, Athens would be next. Aristides ordered his men to attack. The Athenians fought their way across the battlefield, forming a phalanx of their own and pushing through Persian light infantry and cavalry screens. Men fell, but the formation held. When they finally reached the main battle, they slammed into the Persian left flank like a hammer striking an anvil. The Persians were now being crushed from two directions. The Spartans pressed from the front, the Athenians from the side, and the Persian formation began to buckle under the pressure. The death of Mardonius broke the Persian army. No one knows exactly who killed him. Some sources say he was struck down by a Spartan named Erimnestos. Others say he was killed in the general chaos of the melee, crushed by the press of bodies, or pierced by a spear from an unknown hand. What matters is that the Persian general fell from his white horse into the dust and blood, dead before he hit the ground. His personal guard tried to defend his body, but they were overwhelmed. All 1,000 of them died where they stood, loyal to the end, but dead nonetheless. When word spread that Mardonius was dead, the Persian line disintegrated. The soldiers who'd been fighting desperately suddenly realized they had no commander, no plan, and no hope. The retreat began. But a retreat from a phalanx is not an organized withdrawal, it's a rout. The Persians broke and ran for their fortified camp. The Greeks pursued, killing anyone too slow to escape. The discipline that had held the phalanx together in combat dissolved into individual acts of vengeance. This was payback for Thermopylae, for Athens, for a year of humiliation. The Persian camp was supposed to be a fortress. Mardonius had surrounded it with a wooden palisade, creating a defensive wall 10 feet high. As the routed Persian army streamed back toward the camp, they thought they'd found safety. They were wrong. The Greeks weren't finished. The Spartans, exhausted from hours of fighting in the heat wearing full armor, paused at the walls. They were masters of open battle, but sieges were not their specialty. They'd never developed siege tactics or equipment. Their entire military culture was built around the phalanx and open combat. The Athenians had no such hesitation. Athenian military doctrine was more flexible, more willing to adapt to circumstances. The Athenian hoplites attacked the wooden walls with axes, spears, and sheer determination. They tore down sections of the palisade, pulling out logs and creating gaps. They used shields as battering rams. They stood on each other's shoulders to climb over. They poured into the camp like water through a broken dam. What followed was not a battle, but a massacre. The Persians inside were disorganized, leaderless, and trapped. Many had already thrown down their weapons, expecting quarter. It didn't matter. The Greeks had spent a year living under Persian occupation. They'd watched their cities burn. They'd buried their dead from Thermopylae and Salamis. They'd lived with fear and humiliation. This was payback, and payback came without mercy. Ancient sources describe the slaughter in brutal detail. Herodotus, the Greek historian who chronicled the Persian Wars, wrote that of the 120,000 Persians who fought at Plataea, only 3,000 escaped alive. 117,000 men died in a single day. The Greek losses were reported as fewer than 2,000. Even accounting for ancient exaggeration and the tendency of victors to inflate enemy casualties while minimizing their own, the kill ratio was staggering. It wasn't a battle, it was an extermination. The scale of the killing is hard to comprehend. Picture a modern football stadium packed with people. Now imagine every single person in that stadium dead in the space of an afternoon. Then imagine 9 more stadiums just like it. That's Plataea. The bodies covered the plain for miles. The rivers ran red. Scavengers and carrion birds feasted for weeks. Local farmers would find bones and armor in their fields for generations. But for the Greeks, especially the Spartans, this wasn't just about numbers. This was about honor. After the battle, the Greeks divided the spoils. The Persian camp was filled with treasures beyond imagination. There was gold, silver, elaborate tents with silk furnishings from Persia and India, exotic weapons inlaid with precious stones, and chests of coins meant to pay the army. There were concubines, servants, livestock, and supplies enough to feed a city for months. The Greeks gathered it all and prepared to distribute it according to each city's contribution to the victory. But before the division of spoils, the Greeks held a vote. They voted on who had fought with the most valor, who deserved the most honor. The vote wasn't even close. The Spartans won overwhelmingly. Even the Athenians, who had every reason to promote their own heroes and who'd been crucial to the victory, admitted that Sparta had borne the worst of the fighting and earned the glory. For a Spartan warrior, this mattered more than gold. Honor was currency. Reputation was everything. Gold could be spent. Honor lasted forever. Among the Spartans, one man was singled out for extraordinary bravery. His name was Aristodemus. His story is one of the most tragic and redemptive in Greek history. Aristodemus had been one of the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae, but he hadn't died there. He'd been suffering from an eye infection so severe he could barely see. Leonidas had ordered him to return to Sparta before the final battle. Aristodemus obeyed, but when he arrived home, he faced something worse than death: shame. In Sparta, dying in battle was the highest honor. Surviving when your comrades died was the deepest disgrace. Aristodemus was called a coward. People refused to speak to him. He couldn't find a wife. No one would do business with him. Children threw stones at him in the street. He was socially dead, a ghost walking among the living. For a year, he lived with that shame, knowing that everyone believed he'd abandoned his brothers to save his own life. At Plataea, Aristodemus had one chance at redemption. When the battle began, Aristodemus fought like a man possessed. He broke ranks, which was normally a court-martial offense in the Spartan army, and charged alone into the densest part of the Persian formation. He killed and killed and killed until a Persian spear finally brought him down. He got his wish. He died in battle, fighting the same enemy that had killed his brothers at Thermopylae. But the Spartans voted not to give him the prize for valor. They said he'd fought recklessly, seeking death rather than victory. They said he'd broken formation, endangering his comrades. They gave the honor to another warrior, Posidonius, who'd fought with controlled discipline. Even in death, Aristodemus couldn't escape the shadow of Thermopylae. The victory at Plataea did more than defeat an army. It ended the Persian invasion of Greece forever. After the battle, the remaining Persian forces in Greece either surrendered or fled back to Asia. The Persian navy, already crippled at Salamis, was destroyed in a final battle at Mycale on the same day as Plataea, according to tradition. Whether the battles truly happened on the same day, or whether this was symbolic synchronicity invented by later writers, doesn't matter. What matters is that the double defeat was catastrophic for Persian morale. Xerxes never again attempted to conquer Greece. The empire that had seemed unstoppable had been stopped by a collection of squabbling city-states. But the consequences of Plataea echoed far beyond 479 BC. The victory proved that the Persian Empire, despite its vast resources and manpower, could be beaten by smaller, better organized forces. It validated the Greek way of war: heavy infantry in tight formation, fighting for their homes rather than for an emperor. This lesson would be remembered 70 years later when a Macedonian king named Philip and his son Alexander looked east and saw not an unstoppable empire, but a vulnerable target waiting to be conquered. The psychological impact on Greece was equally profound. For the first time in their history, the Greek city-states had worked together toward a common goal and succeeded. The victory at Plataea created a brief moment of unity, a sense that Greeks, despite their constant infighting, were a people with a shared identity. This unity was fragile and would collapse within decades, leading to the Peloponnesian War, where Athens and Sparta tore Greece apart fighting each other. But the memory of Plataea, of Greeks standing together against an empire, became part of the foundation of Western civilization's self-image. For Sparta specifically, Plataea cemented their reputation as the finest warriors in Greece. The city had been powerful before, but after Plataea, it was legendary. Other Greek cities sought Spartan military advice. Spartan warriors were hired as mercenaries and trainers across the Mediterranean. The image of the Spartan hoplite, disciplined, fearless, and unstoppable, became iconic. It's an image that persists 2,500 years later in movies, books, and popular culture. But there's a darker side to this story. The same discipline and militarism that made Sparta great at Plataea also made it rigid and ultimately doomed. Sparta was a society organized entirely around war. Every institution, every law, every custom existed to produce better soldiers. Spartan boys were taken from their families at age 7 and raised by the state in brutal conditions. They were underfed deliberately, forced to steal food to survive, and beaten if caught not for stealing, but for being clumsy enough to get caught. Weak infants were allegedly left to die of exposure on Mount Taygetus. The Helots, enslaved Greeks who outnumbered Spartan citizens 10 to 1, were routinely terrorized in state-sponsored murder campaigns called the Crypteia to prevent rebellion. This system produced incredible warriors, but it also produced a society that couldn't adapt. While Athens became a center of art, philosophy, and democracy, Sparta remained frozen in amber. While other Greek cities built theaters and academies, Sparta built barracks. While the rest of Greece evolved, Sparta stayed the same. In the long run, this rigidity destroyed them. By the time Alexander the Great united Greece under Macedonian rule, Sparta was a relic, still training for a type of warfare the world had moved beyond. Pausanias himself, the victor of Plataea, provides a cautionary tale. After the battle, he was honored as a hero throughout Greece. He led Spartan forces in subsequent campaigns, capturing Byzantium and extending Spartan influence. But success corrupted him. Ancient sources claim he began wearing Persian clothing, sleeping in Persian-style luxury tents, and acting like a Persian satrap rather than a Spartan general. He was accused of plotting to betray Greece to Persia in exchange for personal power and marriage to Xerxes' daughter. Whether the accusations were true or fabricated by political enemies jealous of his success remains debated by historians. What isn't debated is the result. Pausanias was recalled to Sparta, put on trial for treason, and eventually took refuge in a temple when Spartan authorities came for him. The Spartans, respecting the sanctity of the temple, didn't drag him out. Instead, they sealed the doors and windows and waited. Pausanias starved to death inside, too proud to beg for mercy. The man who'd saved Greece died in disgrace, suspected of becoming the very thing he'd fought against. The irony is almost too perfect. This tragedy captures something essential about the Persian Wars. The conflict wasn't just Persians versus Greeks. It was about what kind of society could best survive in a dangerous world. The Persians represented empire, centralized power, and vast resources coordinated from above. The Greeks represented small independent communities, cooperating only when threatened, with no central authority. At Plataea, the Greek model won, but it was a fragile victory, dependent on circumstances that would never align quite the same way again. When you visit Plataea today, there's not much to see. The plain is quiet, covered in modern farms and olive groves. The rivers still flow where they did in 479 BC, though their courses have shifted slightly. A small monument marks where the battle took place, a simple stone memorial that most tourists skip in favor of more famous sites like Thermopylae or Delphi. The wooden palisade of the Persian camp has long since rotted away. The bones have been plowed under. Nothing remains but the land and the memory. Yet this battlefield changed history as much as any place on Earth. This is where the Persian Empire's westward expansion ended permanently. This is where Western military dominance, based on disciplined heavy infantry rather than cavalry hordes, was established as doctrine. This is where revenge was taken for Thermopylae, for Athens, and for a decade of Persian aggression. This is where a small collection of city-states proved they could defeat the largest empire in the world through superior training, tactics, and sheer refusal to accept subjugation. The men who fought at Plataea were not professional soldiers in the modern sense. The Spartans were the closest thing to professionals, but even they were primarily citizens who happened to train for war constantly. The Athenians were citizens who put down their tools and picked up spears when needed. The allies were militia from small towns. Yet when pressed, when their civilization faced extinction, these amateur soldiers destroyed the finest army the ancient world had assembled. They did it through discipline, through fighting for something they believed in, and through the accumulated military wisdom of generations of Greek warfare refined to lethal perfection. There's something profoundly human in this story. The Persians had every advantage: numbers, cavalry, resources, experience, and professional command. They should have won. The mathematics said they should have won. But mathematics doesn't account for rage, grief, and the refusal to accept defeat. The Greeks at Plataea were fighting for something the Persians couldn't understand: the right to govern themselves, to live free of imperial control. to die on their own terms rather than live as subjects. This is why Plataea matters beyond military history. It's a story about small communities resisting empire. It's about discipline overcoming numbers. It's about revenge not as petty vindictiveness but as justice served cold and absolute. When the Spartans stood over the body of Mardonius, when they walked through the Persian camp counting the dead, they weren't just celebrating a military victory. They were closing a chapter of humiliation and terror. They were telling the world that Sparta could be beaten, could be mocked, could watch its king die in a narrow pass, but it would never, ever forgive. The lesson of Plataea echoed through history. It influenced how Alexander the Great planned his invasion of Persia, proving that the empire could be conquered. It shaped Roman military doctrine, which adopted and adapted the Greek phalanx into the legion. It provided inspiration during the Renaissance when Europeans rediscovered classical texts and saw themselves as inheritors of Greek civilization. It was invoked during World War II when Greece again faced invasion by a superior force and fought back with desperate courage. The specific tactics of hoplite warfare are obsolete. No modern army fights in a phalanx with bronze shields and 8-foot spears. But the principle remains eternally relevant. A smaller force, properly led and motivated, can defeat a larger one. Superior training can overcome superior numbers. Discipline can triumph over chaos. And people fighting for their freedom in homes will always have an advantage over soldiers fighting for an emperor's ambition. If you're still with me, you're clearly someone who values the deep, often brutal truths that shaped our world. If this story of Spartan revenge resonated with you, please give this video a like. It truly helps these forgotten stories reach more people. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you don't miss our next deep dive into the battles that built Western civilization. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Sparta's victory at Plataea was worth the cost of creating such a militaristic society? Or was their discipline the only thing that saved Greece from Persian conquest? Would Greece have been better off under Persian rule, enjoying the empire's wealth and stability? Or was freedom worth any price? Let the debate begin below. Until next time, remember that history isn't just about what happened. It's about understanding why small groups of determined people can change the world when they refuse to accept defeat.